Dr. Miriam Shadis, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a professor of history at Ohio University, where I teach courses on medieval women, medieval Spain, the Crusades, and a couple of other things. My own work is on medieval Iberia, and I specifically look at or study elite women, royal women, mothers, daughters, sisters, queens, those kinds of people. So that's what I'm working on these days.
And what first drew you to the Middle Ages? Is it the same thing that you study now, or was there some other sort of gateway?
It is not what I study now at all. And in fact, it took me a long time to get to the Middle Ages because I was very interested in modern things. I was thinking this morning about this. I refused to take Latin in high school because, it was a dead language, and I studied Spanish, which was a modern language that people spoke all over the world. But I have always been really interested in history and in sort of what came before, where do we come from, whoever we might be. And I've always been really interested in art. I grew up amongst artists and Catholic artists, in fact, and that I think makes a big difference because when I was in college, I had to write a thesis and I had to choose something. I was kind of desperate for a topic, and I had just taken an art history course. And so I chose to work on a manuscript that doesn't exist anymore. It was blown up during World War II, the Gospel Book of Abbot Wedricus. And this was my sort of entree into medieval things. I understood the religious background pretty well. I started to learn about the artistic background of material culture from the Middle Ages. And so I had a kind of an interest at that point. And then when I went to graduate school, I also didn't know what I wanted to study, but the medieval material was appealing to me, and I had a kind of a leg up on it because of my work with this particular gospel book. As a senior in college. So it took me a long time, and it was no one particular thing, but there was a definite comfort level with it, right? My initial goal was to work on French peasant women. That's what I wanted to study. And I had read a lot of really wonderful scholarship by medievalists working on peasants in England and in Iberia, and I thought I could do this project, and it was impossible. At the time. So desperate again for a topic, I turned to these queens who were waiting for me to work on them. And that's what happened there.
Interesting. So,
yeah.
So there's not really, even if you came late to the Middle Ages, did you have any ideas about the Middle Ages or medieval that you can still recall from your childhood or from films or anything like that, or was it really just something you came to through academic study?
No, I mean, I grew up in this family that my parents were artists, and they were Catholic, and my father is from an immigrant family from Europe, and I think that there was always this attention to this these strands of a past in our family, and there's a story that I tell sometimes about my father taking me to we went to Canada, to Montreal or Quebec for vacation. And there's a basilica church near the city of Quebec called Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré. And I was like 4. And he's like, Miriam, that is a rose window. So I've had like a rose window. I've known what a rose window was my whole life, and I think for me, the material culture of things, it's always been a way of understanding whatever it is I'm studying. And my strong sense that medieval people were enormously creative in really interesting ways, and that their lives were in some respects filled with art and environmental beauty and all these sorts of things that I could relate to in my own world. I think made medieval things appealing to me. Later, maybe as a teenager, I started watching interesting films about Thomas More and there's the one about Thomas More, but there's one about Beckett, right? The great Beckett film. So I felt comfortable watching those stories. I knew something about them, but I resisted it for a long time because I wanted to be modern. Yeah, yeah.
So how, from your perspective since then as a teacher and having taught hundreds or thousands of students about the Middle Ages, what is your sense of what students today think about the Middle Ages when they come into your class? Is there any, do you know where they're getting their ideas from, or whether they have any preconceived notions?
I think there's sort of two maybe really different places that they're coming from. One is nowhere, right? They really have no idea. They're very upfront about that. Like, I don't know, I'm taking this class because I have to, kind of thing. And they kind of have a general sense of when were the Middle Ages, between Rome and the Renaissance, they'll say, or between the Rome and age of exploration or something like that. They kind of might have that sense of things, where generally they'll say Europe maybe, and then you can have interesting conversations about Northern Africa or Japan or other places that had a medieval period, right? Or even North America. So there's this kind of very vague sense of things, and they really don't know. And then the other part, of course, is deeply informed about popular culture, maybe because they've been playing tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons, or maybe because they've been watching, Lord of the Rings, or they're really interested in the Crusades. When I teach the Crusades class, I often have a number of students who know a lot about very specific things. They're really interested in armor or military strategy or something like that. And so it's kind of coming from lots of different directions, but I think that's where their interest is coming from. Once in a great while, I'll meet someone who has traveled somewhere and encountered some of the things that we're talking about, or maybe even knows, more than I do about a specific place or an item. And that's always really interesting. But that's rare, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what, is there something, not necessarily that you want to correct in people's assumptions or understandings of the Middle Ages, but one or two things about the Middle Ages that you feel most eager to get across, like something their takeaway that might be different than what they thought coming into one of your classes?
Yes, I think for me these days, and this is really hard to teach, but it's a kind of just a constant sort of check on assumptions, is to be reminded that this is a very big period of time we're talking about, very, very long, 1,000 years, maybe more, and many different cultures and people, right, that we're trying to kind of understand here a little bit, so that I think, my students must go crazy because I'm always yes, but, or also, right? It's a lot more complex than we think. And I think that these people, the people that we're studying, lived full lives that were complicated, that they had, that they were, fully human people. They weren't stupid, and they weren't, they may have shared some prejudices, or they may have been ignorant of certain things, but that they had, experience of the world, and that they learned material, and they did things, so I don't know. I think it's really this kind of sense that I think sometimes, understandably, that people who don't know a lot about the period will want to sort of lump everything in all together, right? Mm-hmm. So that's just the way it was back then, kind of thing, right? And so trying to kind of unravel that a little bit for them and get them to think that maybe it was a little more complex. Yeah, that's pretty much my thing.
Well, I know in that you teach especially in recent years, you've come to teach a really wide variety of topics, not unrelated to your interests, but not necessarily right in your traditional research, such medieval food history, the life, love, and death. So a little bit of sort of social and cultural history. But with your research about queenship and also, I think, maybe kingship, I don't know if you can separate them. What do you think people get wrong, or what do people get right about medieval kings and queens? Because they are in that small subset of what people think about when they think of the Middle Ages, you know, the
Right.
kings on their thrones, or kings and queens together. Out of your research, what do you think is most important, either to, again, either that people get right or people get wrong from sort of the stereotypes?
So yeah, people have very specific ideas about
Mm.
queens and kings that they don't, and they feel comfortable with those ideas that they don't have, about other things that they just don't know about. And I think that, setting aside the complexity and the differences and all that, and the change over time that happens, um, I think that people's ideas are informed by very specific individuals like Queen Elizabeth, right? Or maybe Queen Isabel and King Fernando of Spain, the people who sponsored Columbus. Um, or, for a long time, I felt comfortable saying, well, if people know anything about the Middle Ages or medieval queens, they know about Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's, because there's movies and there are novels about this woman, and she's just very, very famous in these ways. Um, what I think people get right is that kings and queens were very special, right? They were really unique individuals in society. There was, they had a peer group of elites, nobles, members of their families, and including people in the church, important bishops, or even the Pope might be related to a king or a queen, so they were not alone entirely in society, but that they were very special, and they were very, very powerful. But I think what people don't understand about them is, first of all, the kings and queens work together. That it's real clear to scholars now that there are very few kings who never marry, very, very few, right? And they rely on their wives, queens, as partners in government, not just to produce a lot of babies, which is what I think people think about when they think about medieval people in general, that they were just having kids all the time, which is not true, but also kind of interesting. I mean, elite women did have a lot of children. So the queen, right, which is really the focus of what I'm studying, but you're absolutely right, you can't separate the king and the queen. It has a really important role to play. Okay, so there's that part. The second part is that the women that I study, a lot of them, and I got into studying them through this question, is there are a number who are queens in their own right, right? They rule the realm, or they try to rule the realm. They're entitled to rule the realm, not because they're the wife of the king, but because they have inherited the throne in some way. So there's that little piece that sets us back and makes us think hard about what rulership is really like or about. Does it have to be male, right? There's this question there. And then the thing I think that people don't appreciate, it's not that they get it wrong, I bet they just don't think about it. What I notice lately is how hard these people worked. I think if you look at a medieval image of a king or a queen, you see a person sitting on a throne, and on a cushion with their orb and their underlings around them, and they're in power, and they're sitting there on the throne. But they went everywhere, and they worked hard, and it was a hard life. I think it was made easier by their tremendous wealth, right? That's the thing that sets them apart from other people. They have resources. They never, I don't think, ever have to worry about being hungry, right? For example, they have a lot of worries, but they don't have to worry about their comfort and their hunger in the same way that an average person would. So I'm appreciating more and more, though, how hard they actually worked. It was a very difficult job, and one you don't retire from. There's no end to it until you're dead. So yeah.
Well, lastly, I guess you've referred to a number of movies and also, not specifically, but to some books and novels. What is there a favorite form of when you're not working that you relate to the Middle Ages, or do you avoid the Middle Ages entirely? I know you've seen Game of Thrones, and probably some other sort of popular media. So is there any popular media that you would recommend or confess to enjoying
Right.
yourself?
So yeah, gosh, it's funny. For some reason, this just occurred to me when I was a kid and you got the Sunday paper and you got the funnies in the paper. It's true that I love to read. There were two or three comic strips, but one of them was Prince Valiant, which nobody reads anymore. I loved Prince Valiant. So I thought, why don't I ever think about that? I don't necessarily recommend it, but it might be interesting for historical purposes that, comic books and things like that have really
Uh-huh.
been a big part of the popular culture up until I'd say recently, right? Um, I love novels and I prefer probably to get lost in a good novel. And I recently read one that's kind of out of print now called Great Maria, which is about a noblewoman in southern Italy in the 11th century, 12th century maybe. It's kind of unclear, and by a woman named Cecilia Holland. So that was a big, and she's written a lot of novels set in the Middle Ages. I haven't read the other ones. I really do like reading the best. And then my favorite movie, and probably my favorite movie, period, is Lion in Winter. So that's my favorite medieval movie. And it's really a movie about people in the 1960s trying to work out their family drama. But, it's fun. And if you study at all Richard Lionheart or Henry II or Eleanor of Aquitaine, you can really enjoy the depiction of these people and their problems as they meet up for Christmas, right? So classic family scenario where everybody's come together and got to get along during Christmas season. So I do really enjoy that film. And an interesting thing about it that's very unlike Game of Thrones or something like that is that there's very little effort to realism. Right. There's very little effort, even though Game of Thrones has dragons. And I always have to point out to my students, yeah, no dragons. I'm sorry, Scott Bruce, there are no dragons. but there's an effort to kind of have a realistic environment, right? Chainmail and gross dungeons and whatever it's going to be, violence, bloody stuff. And that's not true for Lion in Winter, I think partly because it was made in the 60s, but also partly because it's a play, right? And it has that kind of echo there. So those are what I would offer up, I think, as my examples.
Well, and to one of your earlier points about kings and queens, it also makes it look like a lot of work to be a king or a queen.
It's exhausting.
Yeah, it looks like
gotta go to Rome. Where they keep the Pope. I love that line.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's true.
Great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to interview, and I hope some of our students find their way into some of your classes in the future.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.